right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our monthly Zoom presentation. My name is Gina Bono, and I'm a member and volunteer with the Portland chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon. NPSO promotes the enjoyment, knowledge, and protection of Oregon's native plants. And I would especially like to welcome any new members who might be joining us this evening. As part of our mission, we present a speaker each month on timely topics of botanical interest. Our speaker tonight is Mace Vaughan, the Pollinator and Agricultural Biodiversity Program Co-Director with the Xerces Society. And we will get to his presentation shortly. But first, I'd just like to review some of our Zoom etiquette. So please leave your audio and video turned off during the presentation. After the presentation, we'll have some time to unmute and turn our cameras on. This is a great time for new members to introduce themselves, as well as for everyone to connect with each other virtually. If you do have a question during the program, you can click the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type it into the chat box. Mace will be addressing those questions primarily at the end of the slideshow. We've also added a closed captioning feature, and to enable that, click live transcript to see the text on your program. Looking ahead to April 14th, our virtual program will be with Jerry Carr, who will be speaking about the rare plants of Hawaii and Oregon. So please register for that through our quarterly Calicortis publication if you're a member, or through the meetup page. April is also Native Plant Appreciation Month, and we encourage you to join us in celebration by attending one of the many hikes that we have planned, as well as some in-person and virtual activities, which you can find more about either through the Calicortis or the meetup page. With that, I would like to turn it over to Portland Chapter Treasurer Lisa Shaw, who will be introducing our speaker. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Gina. So yes, I'm Lisa Shaw, and I'm the treasurer. I am also one of the iNaturalist promoters for our Native Plant Month, and following with the Native Wildflower Month. So please join us on your iPhone or your Android on your iNaturalist. Join the program, the project. And if you don't know how to use it, I know that if you check your bulletin, either Corvallis or Emerald are doing a program on April 2nd to learn how to use iNaturalist. And if you have any questions, please contact me. But for tonight, we're thinking about the insects, which you can also track on iNaturalist. And tonight we have with us Mace Vaughan. Mace has over 20 years of experience working on insect and pollinator conservation issues across the US and abroad. His strategic approach to conservation has included work on federal and state policy, restoring habitat, writing guidelines, teaching diverse audiences, conducting and guiding research, and monitoring. He has led the Xerces Pollinator and Egg Biodiversity Conservation Program since 2003. And he is a partner biologist to the Natural Resource Conservation Services West National Technology Support Center in Portland, Oregon since 2008. Mace now co-leads the largest pollinator conservation program in the US, supervising a team of over 25 pollinator conservation specialists stationed across the United States. Mace's work with the Xerces Society and the USDA NRCS has led to the implementation of over 1 million acres of pollinator habitat on farms and ranches throughout the US. Through education and outreach events, he has directly reached thousands of agency staff, farmers, land managers, and homeowners. He has also written extensively on how to reduce the impact of pesticides on pollinators and was invited to serve on the steering committee for an international meeting of regulators, scientists, and industry leaders to develop improved risk assessment strategies to better protect pollinators. Mace has written numerous articles on the conservation of bees, butterflies, aquatic invertebrates, and insects, and is co-author of several books: Attracting Native Pollinators, Protecting North America's Bees and Butterflies, Farming with Native Beneficial Insects, and the Pollinator Conservation Handbook. He is the lead author of Farming for Bees, a guideline for providing native bee habitat on farms. He was a lecturer on honeybee biology and beekeeping at Cornell University, his alma mater, from which he holds master's degrees in entomology and in teaching, and a bachelor's in natural resource management. Mace has conducted research into the behavior and community ecology of insects and has worked as an insect wrangler and bee expert for PBS Nature. We welcome his expertise and hope to learn much from him tonight. Mace?
Thank you so much. Oh, wow. Someone's been busy, I guess. Well, it's a total honor, a huge honor to be with you all tonight on this Thursday evening. And yeah, very excited to share some stories with you about Xerces' work, the work of my team on creating native pollinator habitat, getting native plants established all across the country. Just give me a second here to share my screen. Actually, let me do one thing first. We will kick this off. I do encourage you as we are going along to please, if you've got questions or things you want to dig into, to put those questions into the chat box there on your screen. I've got mine open so I can see if anything comes up, just so you know. And we'll take most of the questions at the end, but give me a second, there's that. But should something come up that we want to just make sure, make sure you all haven't left folks behind, or if something's confusing, please feel free to put it in the chat box, and I might even see it in real time. It's totally possible. All right, let's see. And just to make sure, Gina, Alicia, you guys see my screen okay?
Looks good.
All right. Okay, let's dig in. This is going to be fun. All right, my goal here is to, we'll probably take, I'm aiming for maybe 40 minutes or so, just to leave us some time for some conversation, discussion, questions you all might have. Quite frankly, once we kind of get through this, if you've got questions, even if this inspires thinking maybe about Xerces' work, a lot of the other efforts that I'm not going to have time to touch on today, happy to talk about those as best I can. So why don't we dig in? Yes, as we've stated, I'm the Pollinator and Ag Biodiversity Program co-director at Xerces, and then serve as a partner biologist and a conservation entomologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I do want to just say a couple of thank you slides up front. I mean, I want to say thanks to the Native Plant Society of Oregon, to all of you for the invitation to speak tonight. I also want to thank all the folks who have contributed to Xerces over the last 20, 30, 50 years. We turned 50 years last year. There are over 12,000 Xerces Society members across the world, hundreds and hundreds of farmers and land managers we work with. Scores of private foundations support our work, hundreds of scientists, dozens of federal, state, and local agencies, over 50 companies, it's got to be over 100 by now, and just thousands of people like many of you who are just acting every day to protect invertebrates in your neighborhoods. Frankly, I am, after 20, 25 years, still inspired in this work just because of how so many of you, so many people out there are taking action on the ground. I don't know, keeps me pretty excited. I feel like tides are turning. You're all, of course, encouraged if you want or interested to learn more about Xerces, help spread the word, get yourself a pollinator habitat sign for your pollinator habitat. You can learn more about that at Xerces. And just a little bit of more background, sort of bigger picture for those who maybe not as familiar with the Xerces Society. We have, like I said, been around since 1971. Last year was our 50th year. And we've had this focus, this goal on protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. 3 years ago, there were maybe about maybe 50 of us on staff. With the hiring I have coming up over the next month, we're going to be 70 strong by the time we get to the summer. Our main office is here in beautiful Portland, Oregon, but today we've got offices all across the country with staff, many of my staff working on the ground. And that work, if we look at Xerces overall, includes work obviously on pollinators and conservation biological control and ag biodiversity. These are these things I'm going to talk more about tonight. But we do a ton of work with endangered species. We work with aquatic invertebrates, pesticide protection, urban conservation. I'm going to talk actually at some length tonight about our Be Better certification, but we've also taken on and adopted the Bee City, Bee Campus effort and are fostering that and supporting, oh my goodness, over 250 cities and campuses across the country that have become certified bee cities and bee campuses, and a steadily growing community science program that you could tap into through iNaturalist and a number of other tools to get involved with Bumblebee Watch and Bumblebee Atlas and Monarch monitoring. Oh, all sorts of exciting stuff. So lots going on. And the work I'm going to talk about some tonight involves this, the efforts that we've got ongoing across the country to support the creation of, frankly, millions of acres. It's actually now over 1.5 million acres of pollinator habitat in the last decade or so, last 12 years. Now, to be clear, my staff are not putting 1.5 million acres on the ground. This is through policy work, through program work. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward here. But others at Xerces, we've also worked a lot on public lands and have protected and restored tens of thousands of acres there for at-risk and rare invertebrates, everything from, the hairy-necked tiger beetle to Martin skipper, just a lot of work on the ground supporting habitat. But tonight, I want to focus on the work of these staff. I wish all of these stars were actually people or like little tiny pictures. All of these folks, this is my team of folks across the country that are working right now, mostly on working lands, quote unquote, so farms, ranches, private forests, working mostly with these farmers and increasingly with ranchers to help in either the creation or the management of pollinator habitat all across the country. And so the work that I'm going to talk about tonight really reflects the work of all these folks. Now, it's been mentioned a couple times that I'm a partner biologist with NRCS. So one of our most important funders is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This is the agency that's part of USDA that administers the Farm Bill's conservation provisions. There are billions of dollars each year that are set aside and given out to folks on working lands, farms and ranches, to do conservation work on the ground. And so the NRCS recognized the expertise and the value of partnering with Xerces Society and our staff, and frankly, helping us to grow that staff, so that our people could work on the ground with their conservation planners, with NRCS field office folks who are out there working hand in hand, trying to get financial and technical resources on the ground. So all these stars here in red, these are all people whose salaries are half paid by the NRCS and then half by private foundations or other non-federal funders to really work on the ground to help get this habitat or to train NRCS staff to implement habitat all across the country. And then we've got a team in blue here of all these technical support staff. And in the next few months, we're going to be hiring 4 more staff in the next couple of months alone to help support this effort and increase our outreach on the ground. So a big team, amazing folks. Yeah, I'm pretty proud of these folks. They're amazing. They humble me every day. But tonight, here's what we're going to dig into a little bit more. So over the next, say, half an hour or so, I want to talk more, just kind of reflect on pollinator and beneficial insect, and a little bit of butterfly habitat, just to give you a sense of what is it that this whole team of people are doing on the ground as they try to get, ideally, this permanent native plant rich habitat, on the ground from California to Maine. I then want to talk about some of the specific efforts and specific examples that we've put into place to help build this native plant and pollinator habitat into working landscapes, and how we work, and I guess the types of habitat, the opportunities that we really try to build with farmers and ranchers to get habitat on the ground or to identify it and protect it. And then we'll wrap up with, with some resources that we've developed both to support this work, but also I'm highlighting some of the resources that I think are maybe useful for many of you. I think one of the things that is always on my mind and the mind of my team is we build resources, we build a lot of this material, the guidelines and trainings, et cetera, thinking about farmers and ranchers. But frankly, we do it in a way that we can turn it around and also work with homeowners and other people all across the country to help them, basically take some of the same action on the ground. Maybe the scale is going to be a little bit smaller, but it's still pretty fun to plant an amazing habitat and walk out in late May, early June and just see it, see these beautiful flowers, and then just the life on the flowers as well. It's sort of, it's miniature wildlife in the garden or on the farm. And I don't know, it's pretty exciting to get out there and see. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And we're just going to dive right in. So first, let's step back, and I just want to reflect on for a little bit, what is pollinator? What are beneficial insects? What are the habitat needs that they have, right? So I figure you all have probably had pollinator talks, and you all are into plants. You know how pollination works, and know the value of pollinators. I mean, particularly for flowering plants, in actually pretty much worldwide. I'm trying to remember how, 85% of flowering plants need an animal in order to pollinate. And, here in the temperate zone, the bulk of those animals are going to be our bees, and a little bit butterflies, wasps, flies, moths, etc. Maybe the occasional beetle, but it's really bees that are doing the hardest, the bulk of this work in the temperate zones of the world. And if we are thinking about and trying to meet the needs of these key pollinators and other beneficial insects, frankly, and when I talk about other beneficial insects, I'll reflect on this again. I'm sure these are those animals out there that are feeding on pests in the garden or pests on the farm. So think wasps or wasps eating caterpillars, or lady beetles and their larvae feeding on aphids. Frankly, in my mind, beneficial insects are also all of our insects out there that are food for wildlife. If we can create this fantastic habitat, rich in native wildflowers, rich in native plants, shrubs, trees, etc., all of a sudden we have this abundance of insects in the landscape. And those 89 to 90% of bird species that feed on insects during at least one of their life stages, chick or adult, all of a sudden they're a lot happier and a lot more productive. And frankly, some of the declines we see in grassland birds are very likely tied to declines that we're seeing in insects through much of the US. But let's cast our gaze here on habitat needs for pollinators. And fundamentally, in this case, whether you're on a farm, a ranch, an urban area, in a backyard, we need to be providing food in the form of nectar, pollen, and host plants when we're talking about butterflies, but also bees. I'm going to come back to that. We need some sort of shelter. These are typically nest sites or overwintering sites, and then that safe haven from pesticides. So I just want to dig a little deeper, spend a little time reflecting on each of these. So let's say we're in the Portland area, just as an example, for creating that fantastic pollinator habitat. We're thinking about, or at least I'm thinking about, how, if we look at the landscape, we can incorporate trees, we can incorporate native shrubs, wildflowers, even some grasses into the overall mix, and to provide this food for those pollinators, for those predators and parasitoids that might be attacking, say, pests in the garden, or just part of a natural ecosystem, and giving them this refuge from disturbance, from pesticides, from mowing, or if we're really getting into our habitat, mowing and burning and grazing and things like that. But ideally, we've got this forage through the growing season. The willows right now, in fact, I was watching these willow shrubs here in the lower left-hand corner, like the willows are starting to bloom in the last week or so. So we've got all sorts of bees. This is a small tickle bee, a mining bee coming to feed on that. But the Oregon grape, and then moving into the lupins and spirea in the summer, and pearly everlasting. Our native thistles are hugely important. Thinking about milkweed and bidens and goldenrod and asters, just trying to have as much bloom as we can spread out over the whole growing season, so that as different species of bees emerge, as they do at different times of year, or so that bumblebees who maybe emerge in the spring and are building a colony through the summer and fall have got forage to feed on, or even for those of you who are really into honeybees, they've got something to eat too. The idea is to have this forage available throughout the growing season. And when we're thinking about, when my team is on the ground working with folks all across the country, they're thinking about how do we establish that really nice high value mix of plants for pollinators. And some of the criteria that they're thinking about is, having that sort of that mix of perennials, biennials, and annuals, if we're dealing with herbaceous plantings, thinking about early, mid, and late life history stages. And in this case, what I mean is, plants that are going to come on and be providing resources at different stages over the course of a few years in a planting. So for example, I'm going to talk a fair amount about hedgerows, which is a practice that we are putting a lot of on the ground in order to get this habitat into farms. And I'll reflect a little bit more on the why of that. But ideally, you're starting with smaller shrubs, smaller trees that are getting planted when you're putting those in the ground. It's nice if you can have wildflowers put into that. They're going to be blooming early and fast and coming on board. So you've got some resources on the ground right away. Or in a herbaceous planting, you might have a field like this. This is out on Government Island, a Port of the Portland property that we worked on several years ago. So you might have a lot of plectritis initially jumping up, but as time goes on, that plectritis will start to drop out of the mix. The gilia starts to drop out, and other plants begin to take more real estate over time. Obviously, as I mentioned before, when we're designing these mixes and designing these habitats, we're thinking about early, mid, and late blooming plants, that they're site appropriate, that we've got pesticide-free seed and pesticide-free plants. I'll come back to that as well. And then I'll also talk a little bit more about host plants and nesting plants. That's something we're spending more and more time on. So this is some of what that team thinks about with food. I mentioned buying bee-safe plants. We've actually just come out with new guidelines in the last maybe, I don't know, even just 3 or 4 months, because so many of us, when we go to the local nursery, those plants look beautiful, right? And they look beautiful for a reason sometimes. There's sometimes, they're treated with pesticides, insecticides to keep the pests off, so they look, tip top. Some of those insecticides stick around, like some of those, as you probably heard, can be systemic, meaning they're taken up in the plant and they could come out in the pollen and nectar. And so our pesticide team at Xerces has developed a really nice set of guidelines and fact sheets on how to buy bee-safe plants, the kind of questions to ask your nursery, so that when you go out, even some of our native plants, unless you've really talked to somebody, it's possible. It's very much in the realm of possibility that those plants have been treated with some sort of a systemic insecticide, or treated recently with maybe a longer-lived insecticide to keep them looking good. And so it's just good to know. As a very specific example around this, one effort we've established in several places now, not in Oregon, sadly, but in California, the northeastern US, and then in the Santa Fe area, we've created a whole series of what we're calling pollinator or pollinator monarch butterfly habitat kits. So these are kits that local community groups, farmers, ranchers, parks, community gardens, et cetera, can apply for. And in sourcing the plant materials for those kits, that's a specific example of where we work really closely with those nurseries to understand what their pest management practices are, and to work hand in hand with them to determine what those might be, and then how we can change those in order to make sure that all those plants that we're now purchasing from them to give away are actually bee safe. And it's been interesting. Like there are a couple of nurseries in California we worked with that, you know, they thought they were doing overall, it was fine, it was okay. But there were a couple of products they were using that were long-lived and, you know, on some of these plants. And it was quite useful to work with them, talk with them directly, figure out what they were doing in order to ensure that they were able to help supply us with plants that we felt, you know, 100% good about to be able to get them in the ground. So anyway, just some useful guides that are out there that we actually, it's part of what we do as we work, particularly with the projects that we're working on hand in hand, or that we're, you know, mostly working on to get stuff in the ground. Obviously, when we're thinking about food, a lot of people for many years have been thinking about host plants for butterflies. Classic example of this are milkweed plants for the monarch butterfly. If you're in the Portland area, Willamette Valley, yeah, I don't recommend planting milkweed for monarch butterflies. The monarchs typically don't come up here. You know, if you want to plant it, I'm not adverse to putting some, you know, native or regionally appropriate milkweeds on the ground, especially since they are covered with an amazing number of bees, butterflies, wasps. It's astounding the diversity on those flowers when they're out there in the sun. But, you know, we focus more on milkweed on the east side of the Cascades, and then, of course, all throughout California, eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, Idaho, etc. But just as a specific example, you know, when we're targeting conservation on the ground, many of our plantings are going to include milkweed. We've seen this over 95% decline in the western monarch butterfly population in the last 20 years. And like I said, it's just such a high quality nectar source. So this is just one example of a butterfly host plant. However, like more and more, I'm more and more intrigued, and my staff is more and more intrigued with the idea of quote unquote host plants for specialist native bees. So if you've listened to talks from, say, native bee experts over the years, many of them talk, you know, bees are described as sort of two groups. You've got generalist bees that, like bumblebees are a great example. They visit all sorts of different plants over time. You know, honeybees are generalists. They visit everything, it seems like. Many of our bee species will visit a whole variety of plants, but there are several, many hundreds, in fact, that really only like to collect pollen from a single species, a single genus, maybe a single family. And so it's pretty fun, in my opinion, to start thinking about how we incorporate so at least certain genera in our plantings to try to elevate the potential diversity that those plantings could be supporting. Now, this list that I've got here, this is a generic sort of national list, you know, but some of the plants, some of the genera I would focus on, say in Oregon, certainly include native thistles, the sunflowers, and willows, salix. You know, these are groups of plants. These are, you know, genera that have just a tremendous number of specialist bees that visit them. I mean, I'll highlight, in fact, the willow and the sunflower here. You know, two plants that are easy to get a hold of, and that have a tremendous variety of bees that will only visit, you know, these genera. And I'll make a recommendation, if you haven't heard it before, if you think willows are kind of fun to play with and plant, work with your nursery, work with your supplier, or maybe just buy them in the spring, like right now, so that you know which of those plants are males. It's a dioecious species. You know, female plants are okay, but they don't produce the pollen that you see here in this picture. And it's the pollen producing plants that are really, you know, top notch. Like those are the ones that are just, yeah, that's where you see the bees. That's where you get all excited. And it's pretty fun to watch the bees foraging around. So you can cut, you know, whips from those. I don't know, just go out there and look for those male willow plants. They hit above average. They're pretty fun to get. And so, okay, so there's our host plants for specialist bees. I put a link down here to a website that there's more and more people who are trying to grab information on those unique host plants, quote unquote, those unique plants used by native bees. There's actually a relatively recent it's actually quite exhaustive list of native bee species and their host plants, so their host genera, that it covers the Western US. I've got a link to that here in the bottom of the screen. And I could put that into the chat at the end as well. It links back to Discover Life, so you can see the range of the different bees that are being supported. And I will say one thing that Xerces, that my team is working on right now, is updating all of our plant lists to double the length of them, so they're a little bit longer, but also to include information about which of the species we recommend whether it's for the, maritime Pacific Northwest or, the heart of the Great Plains, which of those species are also, good and important for supporting specialist bees. So I think this is an important thing that is just starting to get more and more attention. And I think it's pretty fun. It's fun to think about. Okay, so we've got our food. We're thinking about food. We're thinking about shelter too. So our bees, our wasps, these are animals that are going to nest either in the ground, they're going to nest in cavities or in twigs like you see here. Maybe they're going to be in snags like old dead limbs and old dead trees, below lodged grasses, thick thatch. Within these nests, they're going to be using mud or digging out mud. They're going to be using leaves and cutting leaf pieces out, resin, oils, pebbles, etc. Like these bees are nesting in a whole variety of places. So that's part of where we're, thinking about trying to create habitat. And when we create, when we're working in these different landscapes. So in the east, we might have logs with rotting wood. There are all sorts of fascinating iridescent green sweat bees that will dig out nests in rotting wood. We don't have those in the Pacific Northwest, but we do have an abundance of bees that are going to nest in these pithy stems. Here's just an example of kind of a simple fence that's just made of these pithy stem plants. Here in the Northwest, whenever you see somebody clearing out a giant pile of Himalayan blackberry and just piling it up, I guarantee you can go into the dead pile of stems and you find yourself a ton of bees nesting in those stems. Usually prick yourself and draw a little blood, sadly, but boy, you get in there and I can always find something that's pretty fun, similar to this. Here's an example of a hedgerow with a thick sort of thatchy understory, a classic place where bumblebees are going to nest or where queens are going to overwinter. And speaking of overwintering queens, queen bumblebees need a place to hide out. And so getting back into the roots, brush, leaf litter, tall grasses that are fallen over, straw mulch, just any sort of undisturbed area back in the woods, raised beds with lots of organic matter or just pine needle thatch that builds up over time. Any place that's got a thick organic layer that's relatively dry, maybe, it doesn't have to be in the sun. It just really has to be dry and be able to be something that a bumblebee queen, a new queen, could dig down into. These are all important places and things that we think about when we're creating habitat. We want to look across the landscape and try to make sure we've got those resources in the landscape. And the last thing I talk about is just at a very high level, just we're thinking as we create these habitats and how we can protect them from pesticide exposure. So a lot of the work we do is helping farmers, gardeners think about prevention and all the different tools and techniques they can bring to help with that. Increasingly, then, how do we then disrupt pests in a way that doesn't involve spraying insecticides? So mating traps, pheromone traps, mating disruption, sanitation and crop rotation, trying to use these different tools that are going to break pest cycles. Ideally, the habitat we create supplying more of those beneficial insects that attack crop pests. This is, true for a farm as well as for your garden. And it's sort of part of that biological control. And then, as the last result, people, will use chemical controls. And if that comes to bear with our projects, we're constantly trying to think about, okay, how do we protect the habitat, set up barriers, buffers, choose active ingredients that are going to have least impact. So going through this whole process is a lot of what my team does. And thinking, for example, about these drift barriers and vegetative barriers, maybe from neighbors for whom, like a landowner we're working with to create habitat, maybe they don't have control over what happens next door. So how do we set up barriers and buffers to protect that? So this is all part of the work that we do when we're creating habitat and we're thinking about habitat on the farm. And one thing that's, I think, pretty fun, and actually I've got it set up. I can also, I appreciate, I don't know if that's Gina, but putting the links in, I really appreciate. Oh, Alicia, thank you for that. As these other ones come up, I'll put links I'll copy and paste. I've got them open in a different screen into the chat box at the end too, just in case you guys want to come back. Make it easy for you. But habitat assessment guides are a tool we've developed to help people look and think about all these things I've just talked about. Talking about, forage, talking about nest sites, talking about pesticide risk reduction, even land management. And we've just come up one in the last year or two focused on yards, gardens, and parks, which is pretty fun, and actually a pretty fun one to think about and get for yourself for your home garden, just to kind of think about your own landscape. So this is where we like to tie all these pieces together. All right, so now let's dig in. What is this habitat that we've been creating? And I want to give you all sort of a tour of the different habitat projects we've been working on to give you a sense of how we're getting now this pollinator habitat on the ground and working with these diverse communities to do that. So again, this reflects the work of this broad team of folks all across the country, and particularly this collaboration with NRCS. And these folks on the ground, like just in the last 5 years, I just quickly threw together a little bit of data on this, but we've got over 800 conservation plans developed. This is where we work with the landowner to assess that habitat on the farm and then make these habitat recommendations and develop plans for putting that habitat on the ground, and then providing technical assistance to more than 800 others just on how to do this without actually developing a full plan. So our folks are busy on the ground, my staff here working with farmers, figure out what to do. So that's one element of this work. The other element that's new that I want to make sure you all know about is we have a new certification called Be Better. It's a first of its kind, pollinator focused, independently verified food and farm certification program, working very closely with Oregon Tilth. They're our current third-party certifier, so they're the ones that keep everybody honest. And well, let's see here. And with funding from the NRCS, who's been a big supporter in all this, we've put together a whole set of guidelines that farmers have to meet if they want to become certified. And this involves having 5% of their farm in habitat, involves protecting nest sites for bees, setting up buffers and protection from pesticides, and then, as I said, getting Oregon Tilth to come out to give that third-party certification. In a couple places you might see this. If you're a shopper at Costco, keep your eyes open for silk almond milk. We've got tens of thousands of acres of almond orchard now certified in California, which is great because almond orchards tend to be pretty bad for bees, and so this is elevating that. Closer to home, Giant and some other brands grown here in the Willamette Valley are certified Be Better, and these are available in season. Coming along, Haagen-Dazs has had some, Be Better ice cream for a long time. So this is another way that we can ideally reward growers who've adopted these practices. Ideally, they're getting a premium for this product that they're supplying, in this case, to Haagen-Dazs or Silk or Giant. That's fundamentally the goal. So this is another program that's out there, and I'm going to show several habitat pictures, from farms that are Be Better certified. So when we're out here, part of what we're doing is going to a farm like this and looking across this landscape and thinking about how in all these different odd areas and different parts of the farm, we can be incorporating pollinator habitat in a way that meets the goals of these farmers and ideally is meeting multiple benefits. So for example, helping with water quality, so sediment capture, nutrient capture, climate change resilience, soil quality, wildlife habitat and corridors, beautification, quite frankly, screening, noise reduction, weed seed capture, thinking about crop isolation distances and a way to work with those, carbon sequestration, also non-habitat as a buffer. These are all the things ideally my team is thinking about and trying to put together as they're designing native plantings to put on the ground. I mean, if a farmer is going to invest, they need to have many reasons. I wish I could say that pollinators and biodiversity is all it takes, but frequently, we've got other goals that we need to meet. And so that's part of the thinking that we go through and part of the collaboration and frankly, kind of the fun when you've got a grower who's excited about putting some habitat on the ground with us. We get to think about all these different pieces so we can meet their needs as well as our goals. So let's look at some examples here. 1 second. So some of the challenges, particularly in the dry West, involves getting plants established. And frequently we end up doing a lot of mulching, a lot of irrigation, not a lot of irrigation, but putting a little bit of water onto our plants so that we can get, this habitat established on the ground. And now you'll notice, I'm going to apologize, there are going to be some numbers tucked in some of these slides, like 420. 420 is the bureaucratic number associated with the wildlife habitat planting practice at NRCS. So if you're a farmer who wants to plant wildlife habitat, I would have you work with practice 420. Here's an example of a wildlife habitat planting where we've gone in, selected a whole collection of native wildflowers in this case, and this is either a cherry or an apple orchard up in Washington in the Othello area. Where we've gone in around some of the irrigation ponds they've got. We've done this at several sites up there. These are mostly Be Better certified farms. to get habitat in the ground up there. We've worked a lot with blueberry farmers all throughout the Willamette Valley in Western Washington. And a lot of these involve seeding projects where we get a little bit more water, and you've got, lupin and poppies and clarkia and things like that coming on board. And often these will be set asides. And typically in this case, this is an organic orchard and a farmer who's really concerned about pesticide risk reduction. So we've got a nice habitat here adjacent to that orchard. I figured I'd show a blueberry field on the other side of the country here in New Hampshire in this case. Again, very perennial rich habitat being planted on the ground in New Hampshire, just as another example. And this can involve too just big meadows and big prairie restoration projects, more so in the Midwest and the East. So we'll work hard. We work to get prairies established and small prairie pockets planted in, say, Oregon, but it's pretty challenging sometimes here with our dry summers to get those to establish well. But we've put, tens of thousands of acres of prairie in and around farms, particularly in the Central Plains, the Midwest, and then in the Northeast. All right, although here closer to home, we've done some really fun things. Another Be Better certified farm is Klickitat Canyon Vineyard up in the gorge here. I want to say White Salmon area in Washington, where these folks have got a beautiful wine grape vineyard with basically just like, imagine you're hiking up Dog Mountain, but now that's underneath a vineyard. You've got balsam roots and lupin and all sorts of plants that come in the springtime. They have very little diversity mid to late summer, so we've had to create habitat on the edge of the farm to help support that. But they get this tremendous bloom in the understory early season, and then this successful vineyard growing on top of it, from which you can buy vinegars and wine. It's all Be Better certified. So just another example where that Be Better certification comes in. Let's see, thinking a little bit more on the east side of the Cascades, one area we're trying to take more and more advantage of are pivot corners on a lot of the irrigation fields there. There tend to be a lot of weeds there, and so we focus more on shrubs and pretty aggressive shrubs like spirea and rose and snowberry that hopefully can outcompete some of those weeds and take what is basically kind of a weedy habitat and turn it into something of some sort of value for pollinators and beneficial insects and wildlife. We do a lot of field border work. So the edge of fields, and this is actually one of the largest organic farms in north central Montana. And the Villicus farms, and they've got these 40-acre blocks of wheat, of grains and pulses, between each of which they've got these rows of native wildflowers that they planted in as a field border throughout their whole operation. A lot of times we'll think about, okay, we've got some sort of a wetland or a slough in this case. Now we're in the Central Valley of California outside of Davis, where we're trying to set up some sort of a filter strip to capture runoff and dirt, soil that's running off the farm. And so we'll plant the edges. There's a slough, there's a waterway down just off of this down to the left here, below where my arrow is. So we'll plant this with wildflowers. In this case, a lot of phacelia, poppy. There's a shrub row planted in here, to try to capture all that runoff. So similarly, there are a lot of irrigation canals throughout the West, which afford a great opportunity to plant large hedgerows, potentially on one side, leaving one side open so you can get in and clean and work with the, maintain the canal. But this leaves this other side as a corridor, as wildlife habitat, as basically a hedgerow, and gives us a chance even here on this herbaceous strip to potentially incorporate wildflowers into that, which leads us to our hedgerows. So hedgerows, frankly, are kind of our gateway, right? This is a practice, especially in the dry West, and that even includes the west side of the Cascades. Hedgerows are proving to be a really effective way for us to incorporate native shrubs, native wildflowers into a farm landscape in a way that has a high likelihood of successful establishment, because we put a drip irrigation line on all of this, typically mulch them, and just lets us really get some pretty nice habitats established pretty quickly. That's, I just want to share, like, there are numerous examples of hedgerows now all across the West and the East. some of them getting to be, quite large. Here's a Be Better certified almond orchard in California. Actually, let's see, this is also a Be Better certified almond orchard in California with a lot of ceanothus. Here, a whole variety of native shrubs planted on either side of this service road. Sometimes these can include a lot of herbaceous plants. We go to Idaho here, and there are hedgerows there, just a whole variety of large wildflowers and small, just a real diversity of plantings. Coming back to the Dalles, working closely with several of the cherry growers there, we've helped them think about, plan and design hedgerows all along their roads and the edge of their cherry orchards to come up with plants that are going to complement cherry bloom as time goes on. If we look at take an aerial view, a drone's eye view, we've worked with these sloughs in California to put in miles of hedgerows on Be Better certified orchards there. You can see here 1, 2, 3, 4 rows of shrubs on that side and 2 or 3 rows of shrubs on this side of this slough waterway. Just a great way to take advantage, protect that waterway a little bit more. This is relatively newly planted a couple 3 years ago. I'd actually like to see what it looks like now. It's just amazing to try to get habitat and some sort of habitat connectivity into this landscape. And this can include just a nice, shrubs along a farm road. Okay, switching gears a little bit, we also focus on whatever natural native areas are non-cropped. For example, wetlands prove to be a really helpful place to get, in this case, showy milkweed established in southern Idaho. Here closer to home, you can have all sorts of forage that's available later in the season, bidens and other things that you're only going to find in a wetland or a wetter environment here in the West. I think of, asters and, euthymia, these different species that really like to have wet feet and that will bloom August, maybe even into September, so long as they've got a little bit of water. And so wetlands and wetter areas become an important part as we're thinking about the landscape on a farm, backyard, whatever it might be. One thing we don't do a lot of in the West are thinking about edge feathering. So I won't talk much about that, but we've seen a lot of forest, like there are more forests right now in the Northeast and upstate New York, for example, than there have been in 200 years. And so there's a lot of work to think about either pushing those forest edges back and allowing for this shrub and wildflower layer to grow through, or even cutting little sections out of forest edges to try to open up some habitat. We could think about it here in the West as ideally some of the thinning projects that we might look at that are meant to kind of mimic what would have been more regular fire to kind of open up an understory, a little bit more maybe on the east side of the Cascades with our ponderosa pine to get light in that understory to have more diversity. Similar idea here in the east where we're pushing that forest edge back along a meadow, along a pasture, along a farm edge. Accomplishing multiple goals of just getting a more diverse architecture in that landscape. And then a lot of what we think about is how do we then help manage? I'm not going to talk a lot about this is all I'm really going to say about management, but as many of you know, if you've done any sort of native plant work, you need to maintain these plantings. They were often built with some sort of disturbance. And we've got, of course, invasive species that we need to deal with, and then some sort of disturbance, whether that's through fire, grazing, or haying, something to kind of knock back weedy plants that might come in or more aggressive plants that's out there. Elaine, yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I just was looking at the chat, and I think that's exactly right. Some of the early successional forest management gives that opportunity for shrubs, wildflowers, as the forest overstory slowly grows back in. Now I'm going to shift gears for a little bit, just a second here as I head towards wrapping up. Oh, no, not quite yet. Part of what we do too is actually working with ranchers on grazing management. Again, this is a little bit more in the Great Plains right now. We're able to work with farmers from Texas to ranchers from Texas to North Dakota to think about their grazing management, to think about how we can identify important habitat areas on a ranch, for example, and then protect that habitat. Like this is a slightly wetter area on a ranch in southern Idaho that we worked with the landowner to identify, hey, let's keep cattle out of this area, or only let them in every maybe 3 or 4 years, so we can have a lot of these other habitat like showy milkweed here. I'm going to go with, looks like rust species in the background, lemonade berry or something, or maybe it's a ribes. Let some of these other shrubs take up some space. But what I was going to say too, some of this involves using non-native plants and forage. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but in a farm landscape, a little bit of alfalfa in a pasture and letting that go to bloom, thinking about cover cropping as a tool for keeping weeds out of an understory of a young orchard, or in this case a smother crop in a farm field, planting between rows. In an almond orchard, a little crimson clover, timing, putting plants in the ground that are going to bloom very early before we have insecticide sprays in these orchards, and then that these plants will die back before almond bloom and before there's any spraying going on. So we get a pulse of resources, mostly probably for honeybees that are brought in, but still of value. And just some other examples of insectary strips we might work on and put in the ground just to get some habitat incorporated. This actually is an insectary strip of native plants in California, just to get some additional habitat in pretty quickly. The last thing I'll say is, I mentioned a couple times this idea of protecting habitat areas from drift. So part of what our folks do is think about how do we create windbreaks and these different barriers that are designed, to capture drift. It's the only reason to get excited about blue spruce. So have some of that in there to capture some drifting insecticides. So this was my goal tonight, was really to kind of walk through all these different tools. I think of them as tools. I mean, it's sort of dry, but these sort of fun ways that we're collaborating with either farmers or ranchers mostly to try to bring this habitat into the landscape, and try to offer, in this case, I should have said, financial incentives to really get that habitat on the ground, as well as, of course, that technical support to make it happen. So part of how we do that are developing not just trainings and this one-on-one hand-holding with NRCS conservation staff or farmers and ranchers, but developing resources on the ground. One of the ones, I just kept this in here because it's useful. Like, I developed this years ago with folks at actually Oregon State University and the NRCS, just to help us think about where in a farm landscape you might incorporate habitat. So this is a brochure that's available from the NRCS and on our website, just to help think about all these different ideas that I've just shown pictures of. And we use this brochure to help kind of get people fired up about what they could do on the ground. To find resources, we developed this resource center that you could click on a region like the Pacific Northwest. This is where, when we have those new plant lists coming out, it'll probably be the easiest place to find those as time goes on. I mentioned these habitat assessment guides. I've already shown you this slide, so you know about that. But there's just a whole suite of other resources we put together on, on a whole range of things, from habitat establishment to assessment to, planting milkweed to native thistles to collecting your old native wildflower seed to maintaining diverse stands of wildflowers, organic site prep. This is just a pinch of the hundreds of technical tools and technical guides we've developed over the last 20 years, all of which is available through that resource center. And of course, the books we've put together and put out over the last several years. These are, I think, fun resources for folks to tap into to know what to do. You can sign up for our YouTube webpage or get onto our social media. That's all out there too. But with that, I'm going to call it good and see if we've got questions. I'm going to pull that up, and maybe I will let me make the chat a little bit bigger here, and we'll answer a few questions and have a little discussion.
We have two in the chat. Did you see the one from Mary regarding doing the bee certification with the almond orchard? Owners, and whether that will eventually lead to not relying so heavily on the European honeybees?
I wish I could just say unequivocally, yeah, for sure. But sadly, because the density of the size of those almond orchards is so great, that we know that when we put habitat on those apple orchards, we're able to demonstrate an increase in almond pollination. It is not enough to meet the needs of a 400 or 1,200 acre orchard block. So we can get that habitat in, but it is not enough to supply, sadly, all the crop pollination. What we hope it does, though, is reduce, the goal of Be Better, the way it's designed, is to reduce impacts to the native bees in the landscape around those orchards. And also, I hope, offer beekeepers who are bringing their bees in some additional forage that's a little bit more diverse to help, improve their health, because they're coming in there. I kind of joke, sometimes I feel like beekeepers take their bees to almonds and they're just getting, they just get hammered. And so if we can provide some additional forage resources, my hope is that that helps make those hives, a little bit healthier, and maybe reduce the need to have quite as many. So not the most satisfying. I wish I could say pollination was enough of a reason to put habitat on the ground. I think we'd see a lot more habitat out there. It's a great question. And then I see too, it looks like Cloudy asked a question about carbon sequestration. We don't do anything with biochar. Our goal when we think about carbon sequestration, it's not a lot necessarily for the plantings we've got, but by creating the habitats that have no soil disturbance, ideally that are planted in woody shrubs, woody trees, as well as wildflowers, we're trying to get then that root matter built up, the carbon built up in those woody products over time, just to be part of the carbon sequestration big picture. We also encourage those farms to practice regenerative farming practices in the crop fields themselves. And that involves reduced tillage, reduced disturbance, again, trying to have as much root organic matter build up in the soil. And so we're trying to be part of that overall system, just to be capturing that much more carbon. Let's face it, it's not a ton compared to the need, but it's better than nothing. And it kind of gets at some of these overall goals. When we look at the hundreds of millions of acres of ag in the US, it's kind of our way of reminding people that this is an important consideration in those landscapes. So that's a great question. Willow, should I just go down these questions here as we go along? Does that make sense?
Yeah, because they're all coming in right now, so there's no sense me writing them down to then tell you. So if you can read them with your dual screen, that would be awesome.
Yeah, totally. Let me know if I should put that last picture back up. I just put it on my video for right now. Okay. Just let me know. But yeah, Elaine, I commented on Elaine Stewart's question about early successional forest management. I've been thinking about this a lot. We're thinking about some edge thinning, particularly like the Hood River area around some of the orchards up there. Better ventilation for the orchards potentially, but also opening up an understory to have, some huckleberry coming in, and I don't know, just whatever understory wildflowers and shrubs that might come into that landscape. Let's see, Alicia, how do these collaborations with farmers get initiated? That is a great question. We do a lot of outreach. So I feel like to demonstrate leadership, to be leaders in this sort of, in this arena, part of what our staff do, most of them have got some background, either actually increasingly a background, either in pollinator specifically or in native plants and native plant conservation. And so when we give talks to tens of thousands of people a year about these ideas, about the value of habitat, whether it is for pollination or wildlife or just part of addressing the biodiversity crisis. And so a lot of farmers come to us because they're maybe already interested and looking for expertise, because farmers are amazing at growing cherries, or amazing at growing a whole 20 different crops, or 30 or 40 to 50 different crops if you're a CSA diversified farmer. But maybe growing a hedgerow or growing a little bit of prairie isn't something you've been trained in. Our staff then can come and help with that. So sometimes they're just naturally interested. They may come directly to us. They may go to the NRCS or a conservation district, who then reach out to us for technical support. Sometimes we're just out there trying to inspire folks to value the habitat they already have, and to think about how they can protect it or expand it. So it's a real diversity of mechanisms. And a lot of times NRCS will have a farmer that comes to them, and then the NRCS will come to us and say, hey, can you help out with this, for example? It's great. Let's see, John, can you recommend or post a link to some seed mixes for the Portland area and where to get them? Oof, that's one. Let me, I can follow up on that. Seed mixes are a bear. I will admit, if I had to just go to one place to think about, seed mixes for Portland, that are of native plants, my mind goes straight to heritage seedlings. And looking at what they've got, the challenge there, I think sometimes, I don't know if they're selling in small lots at the moment, But that's where I would start is heritage seedlings. I might quickly look to see what they've got there. Cool. Excellent on the attractive pollinators. That's really great. Let's see, that's up to me. Amy, I'll get back to you. Let's see. Dave Kiefer, do you coordinate with other organizations like, for example, the Nature Conservancy? Yeah, we do quite a bit. So I mentioned put a focus on the NRCS just because they're one of our biggest funders. But there are locally based conservation districts that we work closely with. We partner quite closely with groups like the Monarch Joint Venture, in some places even Pheasants Forever, the National Wild Turkey Federation. American Farmland Trust is a organization that we've just entered into a large partnership with in the Northeast. There are many of our staff have worked for the Nature Conservancy or collaborate with the Nature Conservancy where they are. Bird Conservancy of the Rockies is another organization we work with a lot. So there are many other NGOs, particularly, at least in my group, the team that I oversee that are other NGOs that are working on these working landscapes like farms and ranches. Point Blue down in California, another big one that we work with. So anyway, yes, that's a long answer to a straightforward question. Let's see, what else have we got here? Fred in Corvallis wants to plant Kid K lupin. All right, power to you, but can't get it because listed as threatened. How else might she help? Oh my goodness. Oh, Fender's blue. Kid K lupin is the way to go. And I feel like you're right. Like it's hard to get, you need to get a permit. I might reach out to groups like the Nature Conservancy, the Yamhill Conservation District, I think was trying to do some work around Kincaid's lupin and Fender's blue. There are, I think, a number of partners in the Corvallis area. I have to think about who they might reach out to. And I think, but they're pretty careful about where they're planting that and managing it. I think other ways to help, specifically for the Fender's blue, I think is knowing, I don't know, I might focus on other slightly more common butterflies. I don't have a really good answer other than getting involved with organizations or local agencies that are managing land on the ground. And I might be able to find out some ideas for that. Kim, if you want to send me a quick email, I might be able to connect you up. All right, and what 5 natives would you most like those of us near Portland to plant? Oh my God, okay. First, I think that male willow plants are super fun. You gotta be on them, they'll get crazy, they'll just keep growing. But like right now, you could go out, as soon as it gets to be 60, 70 degrees outside with sun, you're gonna see mining bees on them. And they're beautiful this time of year. I don't know. So I would, just to jumpstart the season, I feel like that's what I'm most satisfied. Oregon grape is nice too, but something about those male willow plants is super satisfying. So that's first. Second, I might choose the second one that comes to mind is fireweed. I adore that plant. It gets big, you get in the sun, it's aggressive, takes up space, tons of different bees are on it. I feel like once it's going in a place that it really likes, it really likes to take over. I tend to like plants that that are a little tough, that want to, take up some space. So I really like fireweed. I would probably also, I would include sunflower in there, just because it's, I don't know, it's late season. So there's so many options that you could plant early in the year that I like to think about what's going to be blooming later on. And that's where Douglas aster is probably another one. My Douglas aster got verticillium and it's killing me. But having Douglas aster, again, if it's not diseased or a diseased soil, it can take off, carve a lot of space out, and bloom pretty late in the season. I think that late season bloom is what we tend to be missing. So that's 4. I also, believe it or not, like snowberrying. It's not just because I like grabbing the little snowberries off of it and throwing them at my daughter because she's hilarious. If you put even a little bit of water on that shrub, it'll bloom. Sometimes you get 2 sets of flowers off of it, and they're kind of tucked away. but oh, it's amazing the bumblebees that are in there, just the variety of bees that are in there. It's not super showy though, so that's where it kind of falls maybe a little bit flat. Okay, those would be the ones that come immediately to mind. So Douglas, the native willow, fireweed, Douglas aster, getting a sunflower in there just because of all the wacky specialist bees that might be on it. Snowberry. I also like the native roses. They're phenomenal, super fun. Plus, some of our leaf cutter bees will cut pieces of leaf out of the edges of them, if not out of the petals. And so they're pretty. I think those are pretty fun too. Yep, those are some ones I would focus on. Okay, Amy, how to get native thistle plants? I don't know. I would like to plant those too. Oh, we don't have any sun. Let me see if I can find. I will ask my co-director, who's much more a native plant person, to see what he knows about native thistle plant. The only place I've seen them is actually at the Corvallis Plant Materials Center, run by the NRCS. They were growing out some native thistle for some parks several years ago, and so that's the place. I even have some pictures, I think, of bumblebees foraging on those. So I might check in with a place like Heritage Seeds and just see what they know. That probably, if I were you, I'd go there to ask them first, just to see what they know. Let's see, Elaine, Native Plant Society, Xerces Backyard Habitat. Oh, that would be pretty, yeah. What can we do to help? I think, I don't know, Native Plant Society. Are you thinking, Elaine, in the context of just the Backyard Habitat program specifically? And I'm assuming the one done with what, Columbia Land Trust and Audubon?
Well, Mace, I'm thinking more generally, if there's, can we help anywhere with like refining plant lists, seed lists, coordinating, supporting NRCS? I mean, those are amazing partnerships out there, but what can we do to help? Because there are people here who really care about plants and bees.
Okay, I get it now. Yeah, totally. A couple of things that have been, this is a topic that has come up a lot, conversations with the Forest Service, both state and federal, with Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's something we focus on a lot in terms of bringing new plants into production, mostly in California. But this is where we've been trying to working with, like, Kathy Pendergrass. I don't know if Kathy's on, but this, Kathy Pendergrass at the NRCS state office, as the plant material specialist there, trying to hone in on target plant lists for working with farmers. And our goal with that is to have some target lists that include mostly things you could get now, but ideally turn around and then hone in on what are some of those plant species that we might want to bring in production. Like, frankly, native thistles, right? Like, I love the questions. Nobody wants to, I don't know. Thistles are one of those things that those native thistles are phenomenal. And breaking down the mental wall around thistles is something that we've talked about at Xerces for years. So I think what might be interesting, Elaine, is to look at some of these plant lists that we've got, that we're working off of, for example. And then what I've told and spoken with the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife and others is, what works for us is honing in on, okay, what are 2 species that we think are important, that we want to make sure we're incorporating into these different plantings, to stepwise begin to add some what we think are potentially important plants, or at least interesting and ecologically valuable plants, into some of these plantings. So that's what I've been promoting. That's what we're implementing down in California. We've got a much more active presence there with supplying habitat kits where we can actually collect seed, get it into production, and then buy the first batches of it to make sure that those nurseries are actually getting paid for growing it. I don't know. That's just one idea that comes to mind. Let's see. Okay. Oh, lots of questions. All right, here we go. Mary, what types of grants may be available for landowners? And this is where it depends. 18 acres, county government on both sides, consolidated, old ag with limited or no production now, wooded and scrub wetlands. So that's what I'm seeing there sounds like kind of old ag land. It's possible. I mean, to qualify for the Farm Bill Conservation Program funds, there needs to meet certain goals, and needs to be working land. And that definition, it's best to talk to somebody in a local field office. So I'm not sure where you're based, but I would go to the field office in Hillsborough or Clackamas counties. Those are over in Oregon City. Those are the two closest ones. You could talk to the NRCS there, because it's potential that this could be, if it's old ag land, maybe it's still eligible. Over time, it varies quite a bit. The conservation districts sometimes have funds and programs available. Partners for Fish and Wildlife is another program I would look into, but what they have available can vary quite a bit. I think there's a whole lot of options there. Oh, Elaine, you're a genius. Thank you for putting in all those amazing folks that are out there. That is great in terms of seed sources: Heritage, Steel, Klamath, Siskiyou, Willamette, Wildlands, Native Meadowscapes. Oh, that's what I was going to say. We're also in the process of, actually related to that, putting together an updated national supplier list. So we've actually got a website it's almost done, that should be out in the next month, that you'll be able to go to click on and search for suppliers of native seeds and native plants that are there helping out, targeting pollinators. So those are great local suggestions, and we're going to have more. We've got some on our website right now, but there's going to be more that's coming along. Let's see. Ginny writes about hosting bee boxes, a small nest in the back porch. Super fun to see females back in. Yep, totally agree. Just want to agree, use only organic sprays. Excellent, excellent. All right, damage. Excellent, Ginny. I love all of that. Oh yeah, there we go. Institute for Applied Ecology. Oh, out at Hag Lake. No way, I didn't know about that one. Has got a project on Kincaid Lupin out there. Good to know. So, all right, Elaine, Helenium. Are those, do we have a native Helenium for Oregon?
Yes, we do. At least Helenium autumnale.
Okay.
Paul Slichter is on here, and he knows a lot more than I do. So does Tanya Harvey. But
Okay.
I would say at least the autumnale, and it likes to keep its feet wet. So right
Yep.
where you showed the euthymia and some of those, the Helenium would be fabulous.
I adore it.
Grindelia, can we kind of pretend it's sunflower-ish?
We absolutely can. Are you kidding me? And that just takes off. So yes, if I had to, Helenium, oh my God, like it's amazing what'll be on that plant. So I highly recommend that. It's interesting that Tanya puts a note in here about coyote brush. I actually toyed with having my last picture be a coyote brush picture. I think of it as more Southern Oregon into California, recognizing that there, it does, kind of come up a little bit further. That is another one that you should look for male plants. I have gone out to hedgerows that we've planted of coyote brush in California that have been male, female, male, 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 female, female, male, female, et cetera, just randomly down the line. And literally as you walked along, you would see hundreds of bees on the male plants and, a little butterfly on the female plants. So for these dioecious plants that are cranking out the pollen, the male plants, definitely be on the lookout for those and think about that. I love it. Grindelia, the native Phacelias, the Phacelia tannacetifolia, so much. Birds, and hope insects can recover for birds. You and me both, Andrea. A lot of, local watershed council. Nice, Tanya. A lot of watershed councils. That's funny. I don't think about those as much as I should. But I think that's a great idea. We got, all right, Elaine, naturally occurring coyote brush in the Portland area. Okay. I just feel like it's a bloody weed in California and I don't see it as much here. So that's exciting. I love it. Question there about alder and hazelnut catkins. Arguably yes, but I would say no. I think honeybees that are desperate for pollen sometimes will go for the very flower-like and nutrient-poor pollens coming out of alder and hazelnut and whatnot sometimes. But I wouldn't go out of your way to plant it. So, or at least it's like those plants have other value, but not so much, not enough that I would, get excited about it. One thing too that you all should know about that I think will be interesting is at Oregon State University. Ramesh Sagili, the honeybee professor there, researcher there, he's leading an effort right now to collect data on pollen nutrient value for wildflowers across, bee forage across California. And I think that's pretty fun. An interesting project underway. Like a lot of what we have right now in terms of understanding value of plants for pollinators involves just, hey, where do we see a lot of bees, butterflies, et cetera. But it'll be interesting to see what we learn about, I guess, improving our knowledge of the nutritional value of pollens. I think the challenge and the thing we don't want to lose track of is you could have something that's super nutritious, but very low quantity. Which is why, yeah, great, the pollen is super, super healthy, but there's just not a lot of it. So I don't know, it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. Okay, woo, I think we did it. Oh, thanks, Tanya. Oregon Floor website, yes, excellent. A list of garden-worthy plants. That is good to know about. I think maybe we'll call it good.